Welcome to Defy These Times, a podcast dedicated to the easy task of tackling the 21st century. It is a project born out of my conviction that doing so requires an interdisciplinary and intersectional approach to understanding our complex world. I'm your host, Joana Varon, and in these episodes I bring you conversations at the intersection of politics, history, philosophy, culture, science, and all the fun stuff in between. The following episode was first published for monthly Patreon supporters. To become a monthly Patreon supporter, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes or check the website for other methods. You can become a supporter for as little as $1 a month. And if you cannot donate, you can still support this project by sharing with your friends and family and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. The music of this podcast is by Tarabeat. Here's the episode. So this is a conversation with Camila Nobrega and Joana Varon. We primarily talked about a paper that they published for Global Information Society Watch entitled Big Tech Goes Greenwashing, Feminist Lenses to Unveil New Tools in the Masters' Houses. This is one of those conversations that I struggle to summarize, but I'll do my best. So we spoke about power structures, big tech, and what kind of future we want. We discussed the issues around Technosolutionism through feminist lenses. We asked questions such as who has the ability to consent, what are we sustaining and what are we developing when we talk of sustainable development, what is green data, what do we even mean by the good life, and so on and so forth. We discussed things like Gatopardismo, meaning essentially proposing changes, quote-unquote changes, while reinforcing existing power structures. We brought up topics like monocultures of minds and other issues surrounding extractivism and data colonialism. We focused quite a bit on Brazil, as they're both from Brazil. Stuff like colonialism, land rights, environmental justice, feminist movements, activists at risk, the far right, obviously Bolsonaro's regime, and so on and so forth. As I said, this is one of those conversations that is about many things at once, and as usual, I would love to hear from you. If you have any comments, feedback, criticism, what have you, please feel free to reach out either by email or on Patreon. So that's it from me, folks. Thank you for listening, and take care.
I'm Camila Nobrega. I'm from Brazil, from Rio de Janeiro more specifically, and I'm currently based in Berlin. I'm a journalist working with topics related to the so-called environment for, I think, more than 15 years now, and basically fostering feminist lenses with the idea of unveil power relations behind conflicts involving human and non-human. More specifically, the case of mega projects such as hydropower dams that affect our bodies and territories. And so I'm creating the project Beyond the Green right now. There will be a website soon. And currently I'm a PhD candidate at the Free University of Berlin in the Department of Political Science, in the Gender Division.
Hi, hello everyone. I'm Joana Varon. I'm executive directress and founded Coding Rights, which is an organization working to expose and trying to redress some power imbalances that are embedded into technologies or in the deployment of technologies. For that, we use also feminist lenses to discuss technology and human rights. I'm also fellow at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policies at the Harvard Kennedy School. So I work on have some foot on academia, but mostly focused on applied research for activism and policy change in the field of tech, feminism, and human rights.
Well, thank you both for chatting with me today. We'll be primarily discussing a paper that you co-wrote for the Global Information Society Watch. And I'll just read the title, Big Tech Grows Greenwashing, Feminist Lenses to Unveil New Tools in the Masters' Houses. So let's just start with some presentation, if that's okay. Just talk to us a bit about the piece, what is it about, what are its main arguments?
Well, okay, I can start. I think the title also really helps a lot. We really tried to be very precise in the title And when we say big tech goes greenwashing, we want to focus in this concept of like greenwashing. And the main thing in the piece is actually it's a result of a process between us two. And basically we are focusing on some gaps that we see both in the debates, the debates on not just the debates, but the processes and decision-making processes related to the deployment of technologies and around the environment. So speaking from my side, and I think then Joana can jump with more in depth the part of technology discussion. But when we talk about the environment, and this is the environment, like talking about the environment is already kind of a frame, but it's more about if we look on social environmental conflicts or how we are defining our relationship to the nature, to what we call nature, like human and non-human, and how we see different conflicts happening all over the world, that goes like beyond climate change. Climate change is one part of that, but everything that we see as environmental degradation and and degradation of people's lives in different parts of the world. So when we talk about it, when we see international like governance bodies as the conference of the parties, that's happening also next month again in Glasgow, the COP26. So these spaces, they focus more on very specific parts of environmental degradation. And there is an hegemonic narrative describing how we can, for example, compensate the degradation, you know, how we can compensate environmental crimes, that the fact that we have rivers disappearing, forests disappearing, social groups disappearing, whole territories, livelihoods, and through like different kinds of compensation. Like planting trees is one of the favorite things, but very like kind of sexy, easy ways of finding a solution for the environment. And at the same time, even in groups that are more critic, that have a critic on that, so that want to discuss, no, we want to talk about social environmental conflicts, you know, we want to see what's behind. So what kind of structures, power structures are behind that? Who are the ones that have power deciding that? Who are the ones sitting in the position of telling what kind of future we want to have, what kind of present and what kind of past we recognize? Even in these groups and in groups that talk about environmental justice, that is the main thing. There is a kind of excitement about technologies, because technologies are seen like it can help us, you know, to, for example, track some things that are happening in the territory. So maybe using more drones, or maybe having the internet everywhere, which is a human right, but how it's coming, you know, and so on. So there is a kind of celebration of tech without having a critique or a more critical lenses. And then ideas of technosolutionism, they also become or are becoming quite popular among people discussing environmental justice. So talking about the environmental debates, this was one part of the lack. And I think now Joana can talk about the other part and how we framed together.
Yeah, I think it's like when you talk about tech, who's tech, who's profiting for that tech? What is it actually a solution? The tech industries use that term, solution, and it's like a magic solution using tech. And we know the problems are more complex and the solution is multi-layered. So it's not a technology that's going to solve social environmental conflicts and not even climate change. So I think the article is trying to bring to a critical view to both narratives, the green economy narratives and the technosolutionist narratives. And for doing that, we are trying to merge a gap between the fields of digital rights, the field of social environmental justice. I think the field of digital rights, in which I've been immersed for more than decades now, is starting to discuss climate change, not social environmental conflicts, is already under this framework of climate change that is important to discuss, but we need to see the bigger picture, and is likely to enter the debate only discussing carbon emissions. And that's exactly the framing that the tech companies are using to enter the debate and position themselves as the problem solvers, as the ones bringing the solutions, not only for that field, but also for across fields, like working with companies and profiting a lot for that. So we saw that in the last years, they were making a lot of promises to reduce emissions and entering that narrative, with technosolutionist narratives also promising solutions for other, for the whole planet, for other economic fields. And we need to have a critical view on that. Aren't we only, if we fall for those narratives, we are just empowering those same monopolies that are causing the problem in which we are immersed with. So bringing that critical view on green economy to digital rights movements, bringing the critical view on technosolutionism to social environmental justice movements, I think was also behind on the goals of the article.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that. I recently had Paz Peña on, and we discussed the paper that she wrote for the Global Information Society Watch on the ecological paradox of digital economies. And in some sense, the theme is related, although I feel we can get even deeper on some of the arguments we got into there. One thing, if that's okay, if you can sort of make it or just talk about it a bit more, because obviously these are a big part of the paper, as far as I can understand it, is that we need to approach technology critically, obviously, but also through this feminist lens. And one thing that I liked how Paz Peña put it because I asked this sort of a similar question, was she views it as very important to render visible the processes that pretend to be invisible, in the sense of technology isn't neutral, essentially. Can you sort of talk about this? Because I like some of the people that you use, the concept of Gatopardismo by the Aymara decolonial thinker, Silvia Cusicanqui. So can you kind of bring that up a bit more, if that's okay?
So Paz, I work a lot with Paz, and we are developing a project called Not My AI, which is exactly thinking about a feminist framework to question AI projects that are being implemented by the public sector. And so going beyond just the human rights lenses and have that analysis of power dynamics. And I think, this vision, I think it permeates many of the things that she writes, I write, and so on. And one of the writings that we had was also, and it connects with your question, was a discussion around consent and power. Consent to the terms of services, the privacy policies, to use tech services, and how this consent is empty of meaning because we are just clicking in a agree button without reading those terms and those privacy policies. And it's like one moment and the consent is forever, and they can even change the terms and you have already consented. So the debate there was like, who has the ability to consent? Who has the ability to say no? If you don't have the ability to say no, and that's a term from Sarah Ahmed, you are actually not consenting. So transposing those thoughts to our article here and to the debate on climate change, on social environmental justice, again, what Camila was saying in the beginning, who has the power to decide those solutions, to decide what is the solution, you know, and to push a particular solution that is actually just maintaining the status quo. And that's the concept of Gatopardismo that Silvia Cusicanqui uses. Is not her concept, but she brings that concept to her context on discussing how governments respond to the needs of indigenous communities. And she says that is proposing changes so that everything remains the same. So those changes are not modifying power structures. Those changes on carbon emissions are necessary, but if they're used just for greenwashing, is just make up in a bigger problem, which is restructuring or changing the political economic model that humanity has taken. Is rethinking capitalism, is rethinking ways of doing things. But what we see is, and I think Camila can speak better about this, is what we see from those big tech companies is this proposition for a monoculture around technology, a Silicon Valley culture around technology. And while what we need is like a diverse model, an alternative model. And I'll pass it to Camila because I talked a lot already.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking while listening. I've been working for some years in this concept of monocultures, and it's interesting to, there's some researchers and some activists talking a lot about how we can understand monocultures in a broader way. Vandana Shiva is one of the most well-known ecofeminist. She identifies herself as an ecofeminist, and she started understanding the monocultures of mind. And yeah, so connecting with what Joana said, I mean, you also mentioned green economy, and maybe it's interesting to unfold a bit the concept of green economy, because this is the idea of understanding like this process of greening everything, you know. So for example, now there is one group of researchers and activists that work together in Brazil, and I'm mentioning Brazil because both come from Brazil, and our paper is also based a lot in Brazil, brings some examples from Brazil. There is one group that is focused on social environmental justice, and they are called Carta de Belém, and they do an amazing work on unveiling the green economy. And they understand the green economy more or less as a way of like different names that came, this proliferation of names for things with the with the aim of just, continuing the reproduction by capitalism, like different forms of accumulation, different forms of doing just the same, not changing any kind of structure. And what I mean by that is, for example, the term of sustainable development, and the basic critique on that is like, what are we sustaining actually? When we say sustainable development, we are already saying we want to sustain development, but what is development? What kind of, well, in my case, I even don't work with the concept of development anymore, but what kind of development is there? And everything now, for example, there is the term of green data. And what does it mean? Basically, some companies are bringing the green data with the idea of saying there is no carbon emissions, or they will compensate, for example, carbon emissions by their that are related to their businesses, and then there are there's this promise of green data, but actually, how can we just compensate, like when we talk about compensating, when we talk about, Joana was talking about consent and about what kind of system we want to live. No, we were talking about a critique on capitalism. So this does not address the problems of, like for example, if, okay, we need that everybody has access to every kind of technology, everybody should have access to internet as soon as possible, but how this process would occur and towards what kind of thing? Usually, it's based in this idea of livelihood, of idea of a good life. And what is a good life? Basically, it's based on an absolutely Eurocentric, white idea of good life. So everybody should just live maybe the life we live in Germany. I don't know, that this is more or less the path towards both the deployment of a lot of technology and the sustainable development ideas. Maybe it's interesting just to mention, next year will be 50 years of the report Limits of the Growth. And Limits of the Growth is a very important reference in the debate on social environmental justice, but it is actually a very dominant, hegemonic narrative. It was made by Club of Rome, and basically a group of researchers, but a lot of people coming from industry sectors. And since then, in 1972, they were trying to figure out how we could just keep development, just keep the path going, and how technology could help, like the environment, not help us not to have big catastrophes, help us still live in this planet, but not changing structures. Basically, the idea was already this good life, that everybody should have a kind of pattern of livelihood. And of course, we both agree on basic human rights. We both agree on that, on some patterns, but at the same time, there are many, we live in a very diverse world, but actually most of the people, the majority of the world do not have space to really decide what to happen. And in the majority of the world, livelihoods are actually disappearing. So ways of dealing with non-human spectrum and ways of social organization, ways of farming, all of these are disappearing. Ways of having assemblies, means of communication, even all of that are disappearing. So yeah, I think we come back to the questions Joana already posed, like who are sitting in these tables to define what is consent, who are the ones that have the right to say no to the bodies, no to things that are going to happen in the territories, not just in the body. So who are the ones? We are addressing that,
I mentioned this on this podcast a number of times because I try and think and talk about degrowth as well. And as it happens, earlier this year, the European Environment Agency, which is the body that advises the EU on everything related to the environment, which the EU usually ignores, even they basically said that the title was Growth Without Economic Growth. And I had an entire conversation just yesterday, actually, with two experts. I think it's going to be the episode that comes out before this one, Yefim and Julia, on the absurdity of a concept like growth without economic growth, and how there is an obsession with even when the actual European Environment Agency, using the data that it has at hand, acknowledges that basically economic growth cannot continue the way it's been continuing because of A, B, C, D, all of the data that they have. They still need to include growth in the title because of how, the politics around that term works. And one of the reasons I wanted to have you two on it as well, in addition to everything that you've already said, is if it's okay to bring in a bit more the Brazilian example, which is a huge example. I know obviously we won't do it justice, but I haven't really done much on Brazil yet. I will at some point once I feel a bit more confident and, did more research and so on. But a lot has happened in Brazil in the past few years alone. It tends to be underreported in the Anglophone world, I think it's fair to say. What can you tell us about your own research, your own experience to a primarily non-Brazilian audience that you feel would be useful for them to know, if that makes sense? Because then my idea is that everything you mentioned, I'm going to write them down in the description and the blog post, and people who want to do more research can start doing that, at least as a start.
I'm thinking if I start from the bad part or the good part, not that I really see these divisions so clearly, but I'll start with some good things because we are talking. Yeah. I mean, Brazil is one of the most diverse countries in the world. For that, usually people start talking about biodiversity, For example, a very concrete thing, I came to Germany and I remember the first time I was going to talk about Brazil, and the person that invites me to a room just before entering the big room with a big audience, and said, it's fine. Did you bring some pictures about pictures of the forest? Because people, they just want to see the forest. And then I just went to another room and I got all the photos I had from forest, because I was like, okay, I can't, it's very hard to deal with European audiences being a Latin American woman. But what I want to say with that is that I'm not just talking about biodiversity in terms of species and non-human. I'm talking basically about a lot of people that are taking care, like since before the colonization of Brazil, are not just taking care, but living in different ways. So we are talking about a territory which was colonized, and this structures a lot our society in many terms, but which is it's still a home for many ways of living, like traditional communities. A lot of traditional communities live in Brazil, but not just that. In different regions, we just have many ways on this relationship between people and nature, just to be more simple on that. So this is Brazil, and there's a lot of social movements are also very strong in Brazil, and I think this is also important to mention. Social environmental justice movements are huge, and Brazil has also one of the biggest movements of landless people, which tells a lot, because land rights are the base. We can't talk about social environmental conflicts and justice in a more structural sense without talking about land rights. And I think Brazil is a big case. okay, so this is one part, and feminist movements are also like huge in Brazil and very diverse, and in all Latin America. That's why we don't talk about feminist, or feminism. It's really about feminisms. And yeah, on the other hand, then I have to mention the more difficult part. I mean, Brazil is also one of the main battlefields of environmental conflicts. We mentioned the Atlas de Conflitos Socio-Territoriais Pan-Amazônico. The data on that are to 2018. Probably now they're going to be more recent data, but they registered almost 1,000 cases, 995, just in the Amazon region. And the Amazon is the most popular region. Everybody talks about the Amazon, the lungs of the world, and so on. But we have different kinds of biomes in Brazil. And so the battlefields are also big in Cerrado, and in other regions. And at the same time, because we live in such a huge diversity, in such a huge alive, environment, we also have many people like environment, human rights defenders that are at risk. So this is the second part. There are a lot of people trying to denounce, trying to engage in the political debate, trying to point the finger to like corporations, for example, that are making a mess, and also the government and so on. And those people have their life threatened, different kinds of persecutions and so on. And at the same time in the research field, and also in communications, I'm talking about that because I'm in between as a journalist, researcher, and an activist. We also have, we have a lot of people investigating and trying to connect, a lot of articulations going on. And at the same time, one of the most difficult extreme right government in the region. So this is, I'll stop here because I already talked a lot, so Joana can jump in, but it's kind of a very complex and fruitful territory, what we are talking about.
Thanks. Before quickly, the reason why I'm also asking is because from my vantage point, as I mostly consume Anglophone media, I'm Spanish and French a bit as well, but it's kind of the same problem as far as I can tell. It focuses a lot on sort of the big, quote unquote, big names, obviously Bolsonaro, and everything gets filtered through that to the extent that what happens on the ground, and that's kind of a general point, usually doesn't get reported as much. And so even mentioning 995 cases, those are not the sort of statistics that I usually see. I have seen a bit better report. I'm gonna say there's some good developments happening in some journalist circles, but definitely not to the extent that's needed. So that's sort of what I had in mind when I asked that question. Sorry, Joana.
So just before I pass to Joana, because then she can really dive into it. That's why we decided to do this text. One of the reasons, because when we see the companies bringing their narratives, the big tech, they want to say, they have this excitement also towards the environment, they want to go to the COP26 and show everything they have as the salvation of the world, blah, blah, blah. They really want to show. And at the same time, so if you see the environmental reports that they show, you won't find this kind of data. That's why we were looking for the conflict minerals report. These reports you never see someone mentioning in one of their talks. It's really not very launched. It's not very well addressed. That's why we did that, and we went through the cases in Brazil, the case of the Pitinga mining, for example, that we know that there is a lot still to be investigated, to be researched, to broaden the thing. But we started making this connection on environmental, social environmental conflicts that are registered. And so where do these companies, what kind of, like, what's part of their chains of production, you know, and what kind of minerals, so we can really make the connections better from, and to show it's not just a virtual thing. Like the technology is something very structural and very concrete. And then for sure, Joana can talk a lot about it.
Yeah, today I woke up and I checked the news, and there was this report published at Communications, Earth and Environment, which is a publication from the group of Nature magazine. And it was released today, stressing this process of savanization of the Amazon. Is it proper English? So Amazon turning into a savanna.
Into a savanna, yeah.
And stressing that process that's already ongoing is gonna lead to 6 million people living in a extreme thermic risk that presents a risk to health problems. You know? And then one of the things that I highlighted from the article was the researchers saying, when you are under 40 degrees Celsius in the shadow, when it's 40 degrees Celsius in the shadow, where do you go? Where are you going to hide? It's not 40 degrees Celsius under the sun. And that's a result of carbon emissions, but also of deforestation, but also a result of mining, a result of what's the word? Forgot the word, but the agribusiness in Brazil, and result of the politics that Bolsonaro has been imposing, dismantling environmental protections, but also a result of how the world is not only Brazil is destroying the Amazon. And I think that is one of the examples of how this happens is through the case that we brought in the report of, as Camila was saying, instead of looking to the big tech promises of zero carbon emissions, we digged into the conflict minerals report from Alphabet, which is Google's parent company. And we decided to look, okay, what are the minerals that they are extracting from Brazil? And we found that they had many suppliers in Brazil, particularly in the Amazon region, but also in Minas Gerais. And then we started to focus, okay, let's dig a little bit in the providers. So we found that Mineração Taboca, one of the providers, operates in Mina de Pitinga mine in the Amazon region to extract tantalum. And we found out that Brazil has 51% of the world's tantalum deposit, which is key for electronic industry. And then digging a bit deeper, actually not even too deep, we just Google Pitinga mine on Google Earth, and then we saw that it was a huge spot of deforestation right in the middle of the Amazon. And then digging a little bit deeper, we started to find reports on environmental conflict, social environmental conflict around that particular mining. And in one report from Instituto Socioambiental, ISA, we had some data that the company was conducting mining in indigenous lands of the Aimiri Atroari to extract also cassiterita tin. That's the basis for tin, also for the electronic industry. So there is a lot of conflicts to be untangled, a lot of light to be shed in the whole production chain that is not only focused on carbon emissions, but focusing on not only the circular economy, but focusing on, again, whose lives are being destroyed for Google to be able to extract things that they need to, minerals that they need to, and then bring us with the solutions that will not solve anything, but maybe have destroyed alternatives, ways of living from the place that this mining, these minerals have been extracted. So the report was an attempt to point to the whole picture with that example. And I'm sure there will be many more. We just managed to dig on one of the whole suppliers.
Joana mentioned because what we did we also compared when we found the companies that were part of the production chain of Alphabet. We then compared with there are some data kind of mapping efforts that are quite recent on the effort on mapping social environmental conflicts. So one of them is in the University of Autonomous University of Barcelona, in the ICTA, and it's an effort coordinated by the professor Martinez Allier, but they have the biggest data right now, like biggest, how do you say, repository? Yeah. The biggest repository on about social environmental conflict. So what we did was also to compare, and then some places, the case of mine, the Pichinga was there, so it was already considered, already categorized as a social environmental conflict. And I'm saying that because the companies also know that it's already, if we know. They also know, they are also being questioned about that. Some companies, for example, I had as a journalist, I had some companies talking to me, asking why, because I mentioned, this data. So why, what does it mean to be an environmental conflict that they are trying to deal with that? I had that from a mining company, for example, but they do not speak loud about it. It's not in the public debate. What we are trying is to push it, that our aims that people can use as a lens, but to push this debate, not just what the companies want to talk about, what's green, but what's behind, as Joana already said.
One thing that, the last section of the paper, you call it from extractivism to data colonialism, and then you say AI will not save the world. For those who don't know, how would you explain what data colonialism is? Is the example of Google basically? I mean, you can use that as an example maybe, and what, as a linked question, what would a decolonial approach look like to data, if that makes sense?
The examples that we just mentioned are about data. And of course, we want data. We want more data about social environmental conflicts that are happening throughout the whole production chain. We want that data to be out in the open, not first be digging. It was very interesting that report on conflict miners was in a session of a website for investors, not in a session for consumers. So of course we want data. We want data that expose power relations, that expose who is vulnerabilized by those big companies' practices. But what we have on the big data narrative, AI narratives, AI will solve the world narratives, are data as a tool for concentrating even more power. So tech companies were collecting a lot of data about us, about our bodies, about our minds, and now they are shifting or expanding the business models to collect. Not now, it's been happening, we have Google Maps all over, but to connect even more data about territories, and that will give them more power, more monopolies. So Paola Ricaurte, our colleague, feminist colleague and also researcher, brilliant academic and researcher, have many articles pointing out how those data extractivist approaches to human problems are a form of neo-colonialism, because we have data center economies fostering not a change, again, the Gatopardismo, but fostering extractivist models of resource exploitation that goes to exploiting minerals, exploiting data from that territory, then exploiting data from the bodies of the people, and then selling it back to us as solution, labeling it as solution. And we have seen what happened when tech companies promise us that they are the saviors of something. They were the saviors. They have promised us that they were going to be the saviors of democracy. And look where we are now. With them profiting a lot with hate, with misinformation, because those things give them clicks. We point out in the report of Facebook, while it promises all those zero emissions targets, it also is profiting a lot of misinformation ads that are climate denialist ads. So this logic that Shoshana Zubrov points as surveillance capitalism, in which surveillance, beyond operating as a tool for control, is also feeding capitalism. And those companies are the ones who are profiting from the logic of surveillance capitalism, are becoming more powerful than states and richest than big oil companies also. And spreading their business models across all the fields of life under the big data narratives.
I can add, I think Joana already
sure, if you want to.
But yeah, I think when we talk about the colonial feminist approach and like data colonialism, in this case, we also just have to remember that we are talking about colonialism, like new forms of colonialism. So basically, it's the same it's the same structure. So hierarchies of bodies. People like we are in the pandemic, I think it's a very key moment in this deployment of technologies in the more like intimate parts of our lives, our relationships, distant relationships, and all the kinds of contact, or like even with your doctor. Now, depending on the situation, you maybe use, or in some places you can use, your cell phone or something, but maybe you don't have, or maybe your internet's not enough for that, or maybe you even don't have a doctor, because in your region the doctor won't arrive because of the circumstances. I think all of that talks a lot about how we jump in some structures, so how we are invited to participate, or like we are imposed to participate in capitalist dynamics, but we just occupy different positions in that. And so when we talk about that, we are talking about colonial ways of accessing more people and more territories, because the companies, they need more territories in order to have raw material. That's how they look. That's how many companies look to the places, as raw material, not people living. And and we talk about feminist perspectives. I think this is also just important to add. It's our lenses to understand power relations. We are not talking about women or like just the gender in this sense, but we are talking in a broader way of understanding power relations, like what's behind. So even when we're talking about internet, we mentioned in the article Angela Merkel, when she says in the last Internet Governance Forum that was presential in 2019, and we both were there. And she says that she talks about the slogan. The slogan was "One Internet, One Vision, One World," something like that. And I'm not sure about the order, but one vision, one. This idea of one. This one is again this male, white European person, and the person who has access to everything, and then can, of course, have a kind of a role and can participate in decisions, in more decision-making processes. So I just wanted to add that we are connecting colonialism and unveiling colonialism, technosolutionisms, and green economies.
One is so boring if it's just one.
Yeah, it's very simplistic. Well, I know you have to go soon, so I guess what we can do is just the book section, in which I just ask you sort of like to wrap up. And obviously, if you want to add certain thoughts, feel free to do it as you want. What are 3 books that you would recommend? Or I should say also, like, some people have recommended music or movies, basically anything. And to listeners, and why, if you can talk about them a bit.
I recommend a book that I'm reading. Can I recommend? It's in Portuguese. I don't know if...
Yeah, you can, of course.
It's called The Extinction of the Bees, and it's by Natalia Borges Polezo. It just won the Jabuti Prize, which is a prize in literature here in Brazil. And it says it's a deep dive into solitude, a brutal history about a woman, a cat, and a world in collapse. And it shows actually how one is boring and solitude can be sad. But what I like about this book is that the way she brings the narratives that could be seen as it's a fiction, but it sometimes look like an autobiographical book. She's a lesbian character that it's watching also the social environmental conflicts going on, and it's described as it fits in a diary from today, but it has some aspects of speculative future and sci-fi fiction, but it's a sci-fi that's not so far in the future, and it sounds very realistic, and reading to her is like listening to a friend talking, and it intertwines a lot of crises that human beings are passing through with this context of pandemic, solitude, social environmental conflicts, climate change, and so on. So I've been enjoying a lot.
Amazing, thanks. I hope they translate it into English at some point, or I can read Spanish, maybe in Spanish one day.
Maybe she got the prize and she's becoming a bit famous. Maybe that would be a translation.
Okay. Well, Camila, I don't know if you want to recommend anything.
I'm gonna recommend what comes to my mind because I didn't think a lot before. But I mean, we mentioned Silvia Cusicanqui in one text from her, but she has a book called Mundo X es Posible. I don't know if there is an English translation, but like for Spanish and Portuguese readers, I know that there is, like listeners. Yeah, it comes to my mind also. Let's see, many things. I think it's also good. Okay, one choreographer, a dance piece from Amanda Pina. She's amazing. She also talks about amazing stuff like there are videos and so on. So it's a nice choreographer that talks about mining processes, and she's addressing her own territory in the Andes in Latin America that is impacted by Anglo-American. It's a mining company, a huge one, doing a lot of mess in many territories. Yeah, and I think it's good to follow social movements. I mean, I invite also people to maybe to know a bit about, I'm part of a collective called Intervozes in Brazil. We address democratization of communication, but also in connection with environmental struggles, social environmental struggles. The articulation of agroecology in Brazil, specifically also the work many women are doing. So you can find zines, you can find videos, medicinal recipes, this kind of stuff. So many different things. The landless movement from Brazil. I mean, many social movements can just teach us so much, and so many. There are so many struggles. So this is what comes to my mind right now.
Amazing, thanks a lot. Well, I mean, on that note, Camila and Joana, thanks a lot for your time. This has really been amazing. And the way I usually do things is I'm going to obviously re-listen to the episode, and all of the notes that we mentioned, I will include them in the blog post and in the description for listeners if they want to look up like more things and stuff. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Fire These Times is made possible by supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to support through a monthly donation, you can head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes. If you want to explore other options, you can do so by checking out the website.